Anatole also happens to be a former colleague of mine at the Financial Times, as well as having been a long-time columnist for the Times of London in the past. And then on my far left, on your right, is Tim Beardson, who owned and founded Crosby Securities, Crosby Financial Holdings, which was at the time the largest independent investment bank in Asia. He founded that in 1984 and sold it in the late 90s. And he's also written a book about China, Stumbling Giant, The Threats to China's Future. Tim has lived in Hong Kong for almost 40 years and is now chairman of Bixmore, which is an Asian research business. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome you all today and to welcome our speakers. I mean, Brexit is clearly a very, very live topic. I mean, just totally by chance, the FT's splash front page story is about US banks, Wall Street banks, panicking essentially about the uncertainties surrounding Brexit. So this is very much a live topic. And we thought before we start, each of the speakers is convinced that you, the audience, are on the side of the other speaker. So we thought it would be quite nice just to get, we won't do a precise count because it will take too long, but just to get a rough idea of the sense of the room. Can you put your hands up if you're in favor of Brexit? Wow, that's less than I thought, actually. That's interesting. Yeah, because all the people, I've met so many pro-Brexiters, thank you. And then those who oppose Brexit. So Tim was right. They're against you, Tim. That's very interesting. I thought it would be much more 50-50. So there you have it. Whether that's a reflection of Hong Kong or of this particular audience, we don't know. In that case, I think I'll ask Tim to speak first to lay out the case. He's going to talk for about 10 minutes. And then Anatole will talk for about 10 minutes. And then we'll basically open it up to you and we'll have a discussion around the issues. And we'll try and end promptly, as usual, at 2 o'clock. And of course, if you want to tweet, you can do it on at FCCHK, but please keep your phones on silent. And I ask Tim to say a few words. Tim.
Can everybody hear me? My wife generally says that nobody can hear me at all. But that's maybe her aspiration rather than reality. It's the first time in my life, I think, that Victor has ever described me as being on the far left of him. I was slightly surprised by the flyer for the debate today, which described the Brexit result as being a narrow vote. 52% of the British population voted to leave, and 48% voted to stay. Recent American presidential elections of comparable arrangement have had their winner average 52%. The difference is that Brexit had a far, far higher turnout than any of those. Secondly, the British government spent a lot of money telling the voters that Brexit was a bad idea, and to be very specific, they would be £5,200 worse off if they voted for it. They voted decisively for it. The Europhile media has been quite interesting in saying Brexit was the result of populism. Populism appears to be something where the public vote for something that the media doesn't like. But the Financial Times has managed to raise the game a little bit recently by saying that the ultimate decision for Brexit must be made by the British Parliament, the House of Commons and the unelected House of Lords. That would be democratic. If we rely on the vote of the British public, that would be what they call majoritarianism. I think this means that it's something that the public has voted for, that the press would like to delegitimize. I think the same thing can be said about the terms hard and soft Brexit. The proponents of soft Brexit seem to suggest that we can honour the referendum result by formally leaving the European Union, but remaining within the customs union and the single market, which means that every edict of the European Union must be observed, and Britain would not be able to conduct any trade treaties. Such a proposal can only be a complete contempt of democracy. There is no such thing as hard or soft Brexit. We either have Brexit or we don't. My own opinion is that I'm a globalist. I believe in free trade. Therefore, those are my economic reasons for disliking the European Union. What should we... In 1950, 16% of the world lived in the countries that now comprise the European Union. Now, it's 6% of the world. By the end of this century, it's going to be 3% of the world. This is a very narrow sample for Britain to make as its economic home. The Eurozone countries have, in the last 20 years, increased their economy by 1/3. Britain has increased by 1/2, America by 60%, and the world by 75%. When we come out of the European Union, how are we going to trade? We have three choices. One is we trade on World Trade Organization rules, which means we accept there are tariffs out there and we can have tariffs as well. That doesn't seem to stop trade going on. Or we can be part of some trade bloc or series of trade blocs. Or we could say, actually, we're not going to have tariffs. We're going to have no tariffs. You can have them, but we won't. That would be aligning our trade policy with the consumers, not the producers. An interesting idea, might go down well with the voters. If we look at tariffs, in the last 20 years, over 50% of all changes in tariffs have been virtually zero. Under 2.5% have been more than 10% change. And in fact, of all the increases in tariffs in the last 20 years, for every 1%, there's been on average a 0.75% reversion to where it was before. So we're not looking at tariff wars, tariff barriers, and that hasn't been important. What I think that we should see is that the world can trade in a perfectly normal way without being part of a trade bloc. The United States and India do over half their trade on World Trade Organization rules. Germany is one of the largest exporters in the world. Its largest trade partner has no trade treaty. Its fourth largest trade partner has no trade treaty with Germany. The European Union is very committed to protectionist measures. It abhors the primacy of American and British financiers in global finance. It would like to tilt the playing field to prevent that. It's very difficult because you can't easily change gravity. if you don't believe in free markets, it's very difficult to compete successfully in markets. If we look at the moves by the European countries to make it harder for people to trade with them financially without setting up in Europe, the protectionist measures are quite likely to be successful. But of course they come with a cost. The cost is that European companies will pay higher costs for capital and will have less access to skills. Whether this is good or bad for Europe is their decision. If we look at the intermingling of... Go. Okay, well... all right. Ultimately, this is not an economic question, it's a political question, it's a cultural question. Does Britain want to be part of an ever closer political union with Europe? And the answer is most people don't want that. European advocates like to say it's all about economics, but it's not. So, what we've got to say is economists can have all sorts of different opinions about Europe's move, Britain's move from Europe to a wider world. However, ultimately it's a political decision. Economic issues don't matter very much, and people will decide, as they did in the referendum, on the basis of what is in their cultural and political interest. I think that's probably timed out.
One more minute if you want. That's fine, yeah. Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, as we're on this elevated stage, I think I'll stay sitting down, and then you can actually grab me to stop me talking, and also to allow me to look at these notes that I've briefly jotted down in the last few minutes. I think there's bad news and good news that I want to deliver to you here, having just come from England last weekend. I will rather unconventionally start with the bad news and go to the good news. The bad news is what Brexit actually represents. And like Tim, I believe it's not just an economic issue. It is an economic, a political, and a cultural issue. On that, that's perhaps the one point on which we're going to have complete agreement. Unfortunately, I believe that Brexit is very bad news on each one of those grounds. The economic one is the one that gets the most stress, and I'll come back to that. But let me just say a few words about the political and cultural before I talk about the economics. Politically, I think Brexit is a very, very dangerous phenomenon because it was a protest vote, perhaps a justifiable protest vote, but about all kinds of issues, many of which had no direct connection with world trade, protectionism, the relationship to Europe or to the rest of the world. They had to do with the health service, with education, with housing, regional policy, none of which have any connection with European policy. The great danger, and I would say near certainty of Brexit, is that it will not deliver solutions to any, whether it goes well or badly, it will not deliver solutions to any of those disquiets that the population had, and therefore, at the end of the process, even if it does go well, will leave more anger and more dissatisfaction rather than less. And that's if it goes well. The problem, the additional political problem is that over the last year, the Brexit process has not just gone badly, but has distracted attention from all the other political issues which were the real motivators of the vote. And if it does go well, even if Brexit does succeed, it will not result in taking back control, which is the main slogan of which was the main slogan of the Brexit movement. But if it is successful along the free trade lines that Tim and the other more articulate, I would say, and intelligent advocates of Brexit have suggested, it will mean actually reducing control. It will mean reducing tariffs. It will mean more competition. It will mean less regulation. These are all economically perhaps desirable phenomena, but they are the opposite of what many Brexit voters many Brexit voters desired, particularly the ones in the poorer regions of the country who were necessary to tip the Brexit vote to above the 50% mark, to the 52% mark. The Brexit vote consisted of two very, very different factions. The free traders of the kind that Tim described and Tim represents, who might have been, let's say, 20% of the population or 30% of the population, and the anti-free traders, the protectionists, the ones who desire more regulation, more government control, who are the other 22%. So it's an unholy and potentially very dangerous alliance. The second related thing is what Brexit has already done socially and culturally to Britain, which has been, I would say, throughout my lifetime, the most successful multicultural society in the world. You can tell from my name that I didn't come and my family didn't come to England with the Norman Conquest. I've lived most of my life in England since I was 14, and until last year, I really felt at home in the country. Now, frankly, today, I no longer, although I've been a British citizen for the last 40 years, I no longer feel at home, not so much, not just because of the Brexit vote, but because I think of something even more alarming that happened about 3 months after the Brexit vote, which was incidentally when the pound suffered its second big fall, from 160 to 145, or to 155 to 135 on the Brexit vote, and then back down to 125 after this event, which was Theresa May's famous Citizens of Nowhere speech, where she delivered a speech saying that people like us, like you as well, Tim, who feel themselves to be citizens of the world, if you feel a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. And that is very much the culture of Britain today, as a result of which, for example, not only many of my foreign friends now looking to leave the country, but all my family, all my children now applied for Irish passports. Unfortunately, because my wife is Irish, I don't qualify for an Irish passport, but it turns out that I qualify for a Polish passport, which I've now applied for. Now, who would have imagined a year or two ago that a reasonably rational person like myself would consider a Polish passport to be more valuable in the long run than a British passport? But that, I think, is what has happened socially in Britain. Finally, briefly about economics. As I say, I'll be brief because that's what's mostly discussed. The fact is that since 1992, Britain has been the best performing economy of the G7 economies in the world in terms of GDP per head, productivity. It's done much better than Germany, much better than France, but better even than the United States. Why is 1992 a crucial date? This was when two things happened. It was the completion of the single market program, which was Margaret Thatcher's idea of adapting the European Union to cater for the specific competitive advantages that Britain had in the service industries. The completion of the single market program was December 1991. And in September 1992 was so-called Black Wednesday, which I instantly in the Times renamed White Wednesday, was the point at which Britain decided to detach its monetary policy from that of Europe. Incidentally, the biggest advocate of tying the pound to the Deutschmark was no other than Nigel Lawson, one of the main advocates of Brexit today. Now, so what happened in 1992 was Britain got the full benefit of trading in the US, in Europe, in the single market, causing an enormous growth in the service industries, not just financial service industries, but other business services, and also got the benefit of monetary independence, which the rest of Europe, through the Eurozone, the Euro is a big mistake, lacks. So actually, for the last 25 years, Britain has been able to have its cake and eat it. Bizarrely, we've given up on that. And the consequence is that actually this loss of roughly £5,000 per head is going to happen. It's widely claimed that the forecasts which said that Britain would lose something like 7% of GDP have been totally contradicted by events. Far from it. Those forecasts said that 7% of GDP would be lost over the course of about 15 years. If you think about that, that means 0.5% per year. If you look at Britain's performance in the last year relative to the rest of Europe, it has fallen by exactly 0.5% a year. So far, the pessimistic economic forecasts about Brexit have been entirely fulfilled, and they will continue to be fulfilled because the issue is not tariffs. Tariffs have nothing to do with it. The issue is regulation, non-tariff barriers, which are much more important to Britain than to any other economy in the world, because Britain has an unusual, almost one might say unique, apart from Switzerland, comparative advantage in service industries, which are not subject to tariffs, which are not covered in any way by WTO rules, and which are dependent on alignment of laws, alignment of regulations. This was why Margaret Thatcher and Arthur Cockfield invented the idea of the single market, and bizarrely, Britain is now the country having forced Europe into a British mold, with the French and the Germans kicking and screaming, and only forced into it by Margaret Thatcher, is now abandoning this model and leaving them with the benefits of a more competitive service industry while denying that to Britain. So that's all the bad news. Finally, 1 minute, what is the good news? The good news is that Brexit is almost certainly not going to happen in any economically meaningful sense. This may be distressing from a democratic standpoint, but the fact is that there are now, I think, only two realistic options over the next 12 months. Either that Brexit will be reversed completely and abandoned. I think that's not likely, but it is a possibility. Or the much more likely option is that the so-called transition period, which is now the official policy both of the government and of the Labour opposition, is going to turn into a permanent limbo in which Britain continues to operate within the EU as if nothing has changed, which is what Theresa May has promised for the next 2 years. She has promised for the 2 years after 2009 a so-called standstill transition period in which nothing economically meaningful will change. The condition for that will be that Britain continues to contribute to the budget, continues to have free movement of people, and continues to abide by the rules of the European Court of Justice, but will lose all say in those rules. This is a very, very poor outcome from a democratic standpoint, but I think it's the most likely outcome looking ahead. And the last point I'll make is that the so-called European Economic Area, which is effectively what I think Britain is going to be in, was originally set up as a temporary transition period for Norway, which was supposed to last for 11 months. It's now lasted for 24 years. And I'm afraid that this is the fate that Britain has now consigned itself to.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Yes, let's applaud Anatole. And indeed, Tim. Thank you both very much. Two very powerful arguments from either side of the debate. British Hong Konger Tim Beardson said that staying in the EU would be, for Britain, would be contempt of democracy. Polish-British Anatole Kaletsky said that politically Brexit is a very, very dangerous phenomenon. So we have a pretty serious clash of views there. I'm just going to ask one question. I was going to ask a question that you partly answered already, Anatole, so maybe I should ask it to Tim and say, can Brexit be reversed, Tim, and should it be reversed?
I think.
Try the mic, yeah.
Hello? Yeah. Can Brexit be reversed? Well.
Or can it not happen, perhaps is a better way to say it.
If people have voted 52 to 48 for something, if 9 out of 12 regions of a country have voted for something, if the government has spent public money telling people it was wrong and they voted for it, can politicians in all conscience say, you were wrong and you must change your view? I find that very difficult, short of a a Stalinist system to actually achieve.
Yes, of
I'd
course.
I just say a word about that. I think, technically and democratically, there are two problems. One is whether the EU rules allow it to be reversed, and I think that is pretty clear that they would. But the second, much more important point is the democratic point that Tim makes. Now, the only mechanism by which I think the decision could be reversed, or might be reversed, would be a parliamentary vote which doesn't so much reverse it, but rejects whatever proposal is presented or is agreed between the government and the EU to go ahead with Brexit. And a condition of that parliamentary vote would almost certainly have to be a second referendum to ratify the decision to stay within the EU. So I would agree with you, Tim, that a referendum cannot be reversed, finally reversed by a parliamentary vote, but it is perfectly feasible for a parliamentary decision to be made that says the people must be confronted with a final choice which compares a concrete proposition on how we leave the EU with a concrete proposition of staying in the EU, rather than the theoretical question which was asked two years ago.
Could I just quickly say back to Anatole that a concrete proposition is that we simply leave. There is no reason on earth why Britain has to negotiate its departure. Nobody ever negotiated to leave the Roman Empire. They just left. Why Theresa May has been so extraordinarily tolerant of European self-set rules for departure is quite extraordinary. It's in our national interest to leave. We should say we're leaving, and we should go.
Can I ask each of you, if there was a referendum held today, would the vote go the same way? Because after all, the argument for democracy is still holds, presumably. If we have another referendum and the vote goes the other way, is that democratic? And do you think that, obviously it's hard to tell what would happen in 2 years' time, but do you think, Tim, do you think that if people voted again, they would still be in favour of Brexit? And Anatole, do you think that?
Well, obviously we don't know how people will vote. All we know, I think, from recent British history is that the more times you ask people to vote, the more angry they get. They voted for a general election in 2015, a Brexit referendum in 2016, a general election in 2017. They are not happy. That's clear. Are we going to ask them to vote again?
Well, my answer would be that, in principle, your question's absolutely right, whether it's general elections or referenda. Of course, you should be able to vote again outside of African dictatorships. We do not live in a world of one man, one vote, one time. So, of course, it is perfectly reasonable and possible to ask people to vote again, even on exactly the same proposition. But in this case, it wouldn't be the same proposition. It would be a different proposition. It would be a specific proposition. And I think the response, but Tim makes a very valid point. If the vote on Brexit that occurred a year ago were interpreted in the way that he suggests, namely, either we stay in the present arrangements or we simply cut our links, have a total rupture with Europe, and simply tear up the treaties, that would have been a concrete decision. That was not the proposition that was presented to the electorate. Very, very clearly, to some extent Nigel Farage presented, but very, very clearly Boris Johnson, Michael Gove said and stated repeatedly, both in writing and orally, we will be able to continue trading with Europe on essentially the same terms as we have. This will not affect not just the tariffed industries, but this is not going to affect the service industries. This is not going to have an effect on employment. The government gave written assurances to the Japanese car manufacturers that this would not affect their supply chains, and therefore the option of a complete rupture is not there. And the reason that the complete rupture cannot happen, literally cannot happen, is that there would not be a parliamentary majority. It is inconceivable that there would be a parliamentary majority in the current parliament for that kind of breakup, which is why I think Brexit probably won't occur.
Thank you very much. Now, I know we've got a lot of questions. We've got exactly 15 minutes. The lady at the back there under the picture first, and then I can see Marcus Thompson in the front.
Hi, my name is Aga Guzewska, incidentally a holder of a Polish passport. So my question is for Mr. Tim Beard. I agree with you. There can be a concrete decision about leaving, but that's a bit of a short-term view. And the question is, you can always leave and depart, but what is the destination? So what to you is that target model, target proposition under which Brexit and Britain would be successful in the future?
Thank you. Yes. What are we aiming for? Yeah.
Right. As I began to say during my earlier remarks, I think that little Europe, with 3% of the world's population, is not the best position to be in if you want to actually generate economic long-term growth. And even the Europeans, I think, accept that over 90% of the world's future growth is going to be outside the European Union. That's where our future lies. That's where we should be. We should be engaging with the world. That's the exciting thing. I mean, I love French cheese, but that's got nothing to do with where I want to be economically. The future is with the world.
Thanks. Marcus?
I'd like to ask the speakers'
Sorry,
views.
but just introduce yourself briefly. So
Okay.
I know who you are, but other people don't. Yeah.
Okay, Marcus Thompson. I'm not sure I'm a member of the FCC and have been living in Hong Kong for 25 years, originally from the UK, British passport holder. My question to the speakers is, could you talk about the immigration, because that was a very hot topic during the whole Brexit debate. As I understand the situation in the UK at the moment, if you are a non-EU passport holder, it is extremely difficult to get a work permit. On the other hand, if you are a EU passport holder, there's no requirement. So you have this situation where actually effectively UK is unable to control its immigration, because on the one hand it's opened doors to EU and whoever the EU governments choose to allow into their countries. On the other hand, if you're outside the EU trying to get a work permit, and it's extremely difficult. So that it seems to me to be impacting British companies' ability to hire the best quality talent.
Maybe we'll ask Anatole to answer first, and then...
Well, you've described the immigration rules correctly, but all I would say is that if this were really a vote about immigration, and incidentally, a lot of the, well, not a lot, all of the polling suggests that actually it isn't. A clear majority, even of Brexit voters, according to opinion polls, believes that free movement between Europe and the UK should continue, subject to various really quite minor constraints like 3 to 6 month hold, or 6 to 12 month restraint periods on social security payments and things like that. But the mutual permission to live, work, and study between Europe and Britain is actually quite popular, even among the Leave voters. But the problem with the argument that if there weren't so many Europeans coming in, there'd be more freedom for people from outside the EU to come in, is that if you take literally the promises that the government has made about reducing net immigration to below 100,000, you could eliminate all EU immigration, and they would still have to reduce non-EU immigration as well. So there's no headroom in the official policies of the government.
So, Tim, will the world be more open to non-EU... will Britain be more open to non-EU
I agree with Anatole. I mean, I don't think the debate about Brexit was anything to do with immigration. I mean, a lot of the people we work with in England are from Europe. Many of them are from outside Europe. It doesn't matter. We've got no objection about whatsoever. That's not the issue for us. So when it comes to immigration, the only thing that Brexit changes is immigration from Europe. And as Anatole says, most of us are totally comfortable with that, and with British people living in the south of Spain or somewhere. That's fine as well. What I think we need to do is to actually think about a positive immigration strategy for Britain, which is how are we going to get bright PhDs from India? How are we going to get, I mean, I'm the chairman of the China-Oxford Scholarship Fund. I mean, how are we going to get bright Chinese people who've studied at Oxford to actually stay and work there? And those are things that are in Britain's economic interest. It's nothing about trying to limit things. It's about trying to create opportunities for us and for them. I'm all in favor of that. That's what we want. Not mass immigration with no consideration. We want people who are bright and contributors. So maybe we should have a, I don't know, an Australian point system or something, I don't know. But what we should do is try and make sure that the best and the brightest are welcome in Britain as we secure our freedom and as we move forward into engaging with the world. This is really important.
But briefly, weren't a lot of Brexit voters actually, they did think it was about
well,
immigration?
Well, that's the point I wanted to make. You see, you take that view. I think Boris Johnson, frankly, takes that view. But the crucial, probably minority of Brexit voters who it took to get over that 52% mark, there is 15–20% of the population who are very strongly against immigration, the UKIP voters. Without those, you would not have had Brexit. And unfortunately, the government's position, as opposed to your position or even Boris Johnson's personal position, has been captured by that minority who insists that Brexit is about not just minor, but drastic and unprecedented reductions in immigration from across the world, not just from Europe, but also from the rest of the world. So that is now the government's policy, and that is the policy that will be implemented if Brexit goes ahead.
Thank you. We've got a question over there. Anyone on this side of the room keen to ask a question? Or so far, they're all down that end. Yes, the gentleman there.
Hi, everyone. My name is George Delacour. I'm a pilot, so probably don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to Brexit, but I'm a British citizen. My name is George Delacour, so as you can stand by that, my history from family is from France, stretching back in history. But the main thing for me is that I've been disappointed by both of the speakers in really concentrating on the economic things. It's obviously a very important factor. I'm not going to pretend that, but as has been indicated, it's beyond that. Anatole, you stated that there's a lot of things that people have voted, or maybe reasons people have voted for Brexit have actually had nothing to do with the EU. I think one of the things you mentioned was housing. A very simple example was there's just recently been a lady from Africa, I'm not sure which country. She's only in England because of an historical reason, and she applied for housing. The local council turned her down because she didn't fit the criteria for getting a council housing. She went to the ECJ, and they said, nope, she's entitled to it. So to say that it's not affecting those kind of things, I don't think is true. But although economics is a major point, of course, first of all, the world has traded for centuries without blocks. I'm not saying that blocks haven't helped develop trade, but we've done it for centuries without it. There's no reason that England cannot, or sorry, Britain can not continue to do that outside the EU. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It won't be straightforward, but it can definitely be done. But the main thing for me is that the EU, when it was the EEC, I think there's a concept to have European countries being able to, the citizens to travel between those countries without worrying about visas and borders, and to be able to trade between each other without tariffs and without problems. Great idea. The trouble is it's gone beyond that now. We've got a parliament, we've got a bank, then even talking about having an EU army now. And the point is we have I think it's five presidents in the EU, not a single one of whom has a vote from an EU citizen. They're all in place because they're just put in their place by the committee. And what essentially is, and I think this is the major point that a lot of guys voted against Brexit, is that the EU has become a non-democratic, autocratic, bureaucratic system. And I don't want to overstress the point, but in theory, if there's an EU army, people could send me and my children to war, and I had no say in their election. That's wrong.
Okay.
And the whole of the EU now has become non-democratic,
Okay.
and that is the major reason why I voted for Brexit.
Okay, so I think this is mainly a criticism of Anatole, Anatole's position. So is that a problem, the lack of democracy in the EU? And I think it's also a matter of, you're really talking also about British sovereignty, I think. So sovereignty in Britain, lack of democracy in the EU, isn't this a reasonable point to make?
I don't think so. Well, there are two things that you mentioned in a very articulate statement. One is this democracy sovereignty. The other is you went through a whole series of things like housing and so on, and trade, where you gave examples of ways that membership of the EU has aggravated feelings about that. So on the first thing, your example about housing was an excellent one. Of course, people get angry about the kind of situation that you've described. But what I was saying was that when we leave the EU, those kind of incidents may disappear. But that is not going to have the slightest effect on the availability of housing. So you can take all the immigrants out of the housing queues, you can take all the immigrants out of the national health system and so on. They will not actually improve the health service, the education service, and the housing situation. And therefore, I think, after Brexit, people will be even angrier because they will find that actually their everyday lives, which they thought were being blighted by all these foreigners, must be blighted by something else, because their everyday lives will not improve as a result of Brexit. Now, on the question of democracy, people are never going to be satisfied with how much say they have in their own governments. But your point about the presidents of Europe, the leadership of Europe being unelected. Actually, the leadership of Europe is elected through through a series of indirect elections in exactly the same way as our prime minister is not elected. Nobody voted for Theresa May. In fact, even the members of the Conservative Party, as it turned out, didn't vote for Theresa May because she ended up being, an election of one, because all the other candidates fell away. So we have a system all over the world of indirect democracy. There is no successful society anywhere in the world, even Switzerland, that operates on direct democracy of people, of the massive people voting on specific issues. We delegate authority, we delegate sovereignty to intermediate institutions. Now, they may be national parliaments, they may be subnational parliaments, they're also international institutions. You gave the example of a European army. Your children could be sent to their deaths not by a European army, much less likely than that, is NATO. We are members of NATO, which legally requires us to intervene and to send people to war if, for example, Latvia is attacked by the Soviet Union. Our government, from a treaty, from a legal standpoint, would have no option but to send our children to war, to expose Britain to nuclear attack in order to defend Latvia. Why is that any more democratic than membership of the European Union?
Okay. Tim, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe this issue of European army is quite interesting because, of course, we only have to remember back to, 2008, when the Europeans tried to have their first serious military mission, which was into Chad in Africa. Because they'd heard there was some fighting going on and that they ought to get involved because it was a former French colony. And then they realized there was a lot of fighting going on, so they therefore couldn't go. And then it subsided, and they chose somebody to run the mission, somebody called Sean Fitzgerald, who I think one of our hosts will probably know, was a major general in the Irish army, so presumably chosen for his battle experience. And then they realized that Chad was quite a big country, and they couldn't really go into Chad without helicopters. But unfortunately, European countries don't spend any money on defense. So there weren't any helicopters. So their choice was to go to the United States, and they couldn't possibly do that. So they went to Mr. Putin and said, could we please borrow some helicopters, because we've got this very exciting military mission into Chad. And he said, oh, okay, here's a dozen helicopters. So off they went. The following week, he went into Georgia. Washington condemned Russia's adventure in Georgia. The European Union had nothing to say. Just an interesting lesson about a weak country trying to have an army.
We're running out of time, but Tim, isn't Britain quite capable of getting into trouble with the help of the Americans, for example, in Iraq, without needing European allies or a European Union to force us to do foolish things at war?
I'm not a great supporter of wars against Muslim countries. I think they tend to engender terrorism. If it were my choice, I wouldn't be doing it.
Maybe we'd better sort of try and recenter it a bit. We're running out of time on the exact issue of Brexit. Any more questions? Anyone from this side of the room have a question? Or from the press gallery? Over the back? No, I think maybe I can just ask a question about the context before we wind up. The context in which Brexit happens. Is this another example of the kind of rise of identity politics, and some of its nationalism, some of its regionalism, some of its religious identification that we're seeing all around the world? We've seen divisiveness in the United States. We've seen this great division. Anyone who's British will know how divisive an issue Brexit is. We've seen Catalonia. We've seen Scotland's battle for independence on the part of some Scots and opposing it on the side of other Scots. What is this? Is Brexit simply one more phenomenon about people trying to assert a kind of an identity that is not continental or not multinational?
Well, actually, my answer to that could be pretty brief. To some extent, I think that's true, but I think it's also a part of another phenomenon, which is also a global phenomenon, but in a way a more trivial one, which is what I would call fantasy politics. This is part of the phenomenon whereby people vote for propositions which are completely impossible to deliver. They vote for internally contradictory programs. You can have your cake and eat it. The case of Trump, we're going to make America great, but we're going to pull America back from all its commitments in the world. We're going to make the middle class and the working class richer, but we're going to give tax cuts to the rich. Contradictory programs which seem attractive superficially, but are impossible to deliver. And this is, I suppose, my main rebuttal to the whole point about democracy. If you could get people to vote for the proposition that 2 + 2 = 5, it doesn't mean that you can deliver that proposition. And I think that's what's going on in Britain today. That's why our government's failing. That's why the one confident prediction I would make about Brexit, I don't know whether it's going to happen or not, soft, hard, whatever, but that Theresa May will not be the Prime Minister when March 29th, 2019 comes along, because she simply cannot deliver what it was that people voted for. And this is something we see all over the world.
Thanks. I'm going to give the last word to Tim before we close, because it seemed the majority of people were in disagreement with his view. Tim, what does the future hold? What are we going to see in the next couple of years?
Well, I don't believe that it's the end of democracy. I think that what we're seeing, and have seen really almost since the 1950s, is a reassertion of people's sense of national identity, who they are, what their religion is. I think that's actually quite healthy, it's quite good. And a lot of these bogus institutions are actually falling apart. They're no longer relevant. People are much more conscious of who they are, and they're comfortable with who they are. I think that's really good. So I'm not uncomfortable with the world today. I mean, Anatole may be looking back at the 50s and saying how wonderful it was. Personally, I think the 50s was very dull. And I think that now people are actually more interesting, more vibrant, more invigorated. So I don't believe that just saying we voted to be independent is something where 2 and 2 has to equal 5. I think we can say we're willing to take the price. We're willing to accept that the Europeans are going to make it really complicated because they've got so many problems of their own. They have to make departure from the EU look really difficult. Otherwise, everybody else is going to join. So they're going to make it as hard as possible for Britain. I understand that, but the British are just going to go forward anyway because that's what we want.
Thank you very much. On that optimistic note, can you thank our speakers? Thank you. Have some little prezi for you. Oh yes, here we are. Thank you very much to both of you. I'm sure this. You obviously need this. Oh, you need this too, I think. What is it? Well, it looks like it might be a tie.